Wagner, Damon Snacks Harrison, Devon Kennard, Darius Slay. I mean, they really let go, and Graham Glasgow to add another. They let go a lot of their big pieces last year, and the guys they replaced them with, I think overall might be a wash, but there's a little bit of risk there as well. So from a free agency standpoint, maybe these guys are better scheme fits than the guys that they let go, but overall I feel like they lost a lot of good players, but they added a lot of decent players as well. So in terms of, I know you had mentioned having the Senior Bowl and adding free agents that know already the scheme, like all the Patriot players they brought in on defense. I think that's, it could probably help them, but I don't know if it's going to be a significant advantage or anything like that, but it's definitely something to note.
Yeah, Logan, you talked about getting in a lot of guys that have a similar defensive scheme as Matt Patricia. Obviously, from his time in the Lions, we saw that right when he got the job with their big acquisition last offseason of Trey Flowers and then some guys this week. How do you think, at least from your perspective or other inside perspectives, how that's going? Because it's obviously their defense isn't as dominant as the Patriots were, but they're a completely different team, completely different head coach. How do you think that experiment of these, kind of how a lot of fans talk about it jokingly, like the new Patriots instead of the Lions or the Detroit Patriots, how do you see that experiment going so far with Matt Patricia?
Yeah, obviously it's not going as well, considering what the Lions defense was last year. I think they put so much and invested so much into that defensive line. And then once the injuries started adding up last year, that never was really able to take place. You're never able to see a fully healthy unit. And Snacks Harrison declined precipitously after that 2018 season that he had. So it was one of those things where I think that was supposed to be their bread and butter, and it fell just completely off the map of what they thought it was going to be. And then with a team that relies on a ton of pressure, a ton of coverage and getting absolutely no pressure, it didn't help them. So I think they're just different. The Patriots, it's a similar philosophy, but if you look at how often the Lions were blitzing, they were the least in the league. They're most frequently only rushing 3 guys, whereas the Patriots are kind of in the middle of the road and getting pressure at a decent rate. And the Lions, I think their corners last year, even guys like Rashawn Melvin, weren't horrible, and they actually were doing okay. But then towards the end of the year, you just saw them start to break down because that pass rush just was non-existent. So I think that's the biggest thing right now. If you look at the linebackers, kind of the middle of the defense, I think the Lions linebackers are pretty schematically the same as far as what the Patriots are. But it just comes down to pass rush. The Lions have to have guys that can provide more pass rush. And last year, that defensive line, just due to injuries, couldn't do it.
Yeah, I think a lot of that Patriot way is from the amazing brain and genius of Bill Belichick, and Lions are stuck with Matt Patricia, who seems to be on a pretty short leash now. How much leeway are they going to give him through this season?
They really shouldn't give him much at all. There was the chance that he might not even come back, but I think if Bob Quinn and him weren't such close friends and have such a history, Patricia might already be gone because remember, Bob Quinn, he fired Jim Caldwell to bring in his own guy because he wanted to get over that hump and get to the playoffs. And if anything, the last 2 years, Matt Patricia has made the team worse. And yeah, that falls on Quinn a little bit too. But as far as Patricia goes, I think he should definitely be on the hot seat because you can't have back-to-back 9-win seasons and then come in and try to change everything. And yeah, you come from a Patriots culture that has tradition of winning ways, but you got to be adaptable and a little bit more flexible. And I think he did do that a little bit last year. You hear about players coming out saying that last year he softened up a little bit in his coaching style and was a little bit more friendly. But, he's just – anytime you only have 9 wins in 2 seasons, you have to be on the hot seat no matter who your general manager is above a head coach. So for me personally, I understand why they brought Patricia back. You don't want to fire a coach after 2 years. You want to make sure if you're going to hire a guy, you kind of got to see it through and make sure that give it a chance. But, I wouldn't have been upset if they let him go last year. But I think it's just Patricia is kind of tied at the hip with Quinn. And, if one's gone, they're probably both gone.
Yeah, you hear a lot of, especially with Quinn and there seems to have been a lot of head coach turnover and new hires in the past 2 or 3 years in the NFL. So you hear the terms hot seat and all these things thrown out. One thing I've always heard with Patricia since a couple of the trades he's made and like just how he's been, like the outdoor practice, I think, what was it, 2 seasons ago, that a lot of people were scratching their heads at, that he kind of lost the locker room. Do you think he's kind of so far out that he could be a mid-season firing, or do you think he's got this full season to show himself and see what he can do? What do you think is kind of the sentiment from the front office and Bob Quinn, even though they're buddies? Do you think it could be by their bye week or by week 8 or 9 that he could be out?
I think things would really have to hit the fan to be fired mid-season just because of his connection with Bob Quinn. I don't know if Bob Quinn will necessarily get another opportunity to go after a head coach. You know, technically he inherited Jim Caldwell, but he still made him his head coach. It's tough to say how much influence there was from ownership and Martha Ford, because she was publicly known and has said, talked up Jim Caldwell a lot. So maybe she had something to do with Caldwell staying around for the first 2 years of Quinn's time in Detroit, but that's still technically one of his coaching selections coming in. So his second coaching selection is Matt Patricia. I don't know if he gets a third. He hasn't put the team on the right trajectory so far. It's been nothing but pretty much getting worse almost every year. So it's one of those deals where, again, I think Bob Quinn and Matt Patricia are tied at the hip. If Quinn were maybe to be let go midseason, which again, I just don't really see that happening. I think Patricia also would be too, but I don't know why the Lions would want to clean house mid-season. Maybe just to make a statement. Maybe that's Martha Ford, how she would handle things. But anytime that happens, I mean, you have to be really bad to be fired mid-season.
Well, it seems like a lot of those coaches are not only just ones that are really bad, but ones that have been given chance after chance. And after 3 seasons, it doesn't seem like that. Like you saw with Jay Gruden last year, mid-season, he had been around forever and underperforming for a long time. And that was kind of what drove that, it seemed, at least from a fan's perspective.
Yep. No, I agree with that. That usually those mid-season fires are those guys that have been around for a long time and have chance, and it's just time to move on. Whereas the Lions, I think, are in a little bit different situation too. Yes, the expectations from ownership, kind of playoffs or bust, but the expectations aren't necessarily extremely high either. I think a lot of times when guys get fired mid-season, it's just because they're failing miserably. And that's the Lions would have to have like 0 wins by the midway point. And as long as Matthew Stafford healthy, I don't really think that's possible.
Yeah. A slight segue, because we still kind of talking about the Patriot way, and they've kind of gone through an overhaul this offseason with the big man Tom Brady taking a hike over to down to Tampa Bay. They're going to probably have to look at a quarterback potentially, or do they believe Jarrett Stidham's the guy there? Who do you think fits the role of the heir apparent in that Patriot system?
That's a good question because, I feel like the Patriots, even when Brady, yes, there hasn't been too many times in his career where he's been gone, but they used Matt Castle that one year, still went 11-5 when Brady tore his ACL in the first week. They've even used Julian Edelman as a quarterback one week. They've used Garoppolo. They used Jacoby Brissett. They always just, with Belichick, with his mind, I feel like they can almost make any quarterback work, and they'll play the strengths of their team and figure out ways to win. So I think they could go a lot of different ways. Brian Hoyer being back, he didn't look very good when he was in a small stint with the Colts last year, but who knows? With the Patriots, he might look like a completely different player. And the Patriots, it doesn't matter who they put back there. I feel like they can just make it work. But I think they'll be in the market for a quarterback in the first round. I think Jordan Love makes a lot of sense. Maybe they have to trade up a few spots to get him. Usually you have to trade up to get the quarterback you want, but considering their cap space, I think they're dead last in the league right now in terms of cap space. They just have over like $1 million. So it's not like they're going to really be able to bring in anybody or trade for anybody. So it's like, you almost have to go the draft route. I just don't know how much belief they have in Stidham. I think he showed well in the preseason last year, the time he did play. So they could. They could just roll with Stidham or Hoyer and maybe a developmental QB, but I think I'd put the money on them drafting a quarterback in the first round.
Yeah, it seems like every time we say that the Patriots are done, or even if it's Tom Brady himself is over the hill or whatever, Bill Belichick schemes up something out of nowhere just to show that he's still got it. Like, and I think this year that obviously losing Tom Brady, the best quarterback to ever play in the NFL by a lot of people's standards, is a huge hit. But it seems like every time something like this happens, even though this is the biggest one, that Belichick thinks of something. And we always, in 10 weeks into the season, are just like, oh, well, the Patriots are just 9-1 again.
Yeah, it's amazing that no other coaches can have the success that Belichick has found. And I don't know what exactly it is that makes his mind so much on another level. Out of all the people out there in the world, it's like Belichick is just in his own tier. And it's amazing what he's able to do. And I don't, if I knew how to do it, I'd be a millionaire and I probably wouldn't be here. But that's just, a question that might not ever be able to be answered. What makes Belichick such a great mind? And anytime you hear him speak, you can tell he's a very intelligent guy, but it's just, I don't know what it is.
But just last year when we talked just before the draft also, there was talk about Stafford being traded last year too. And now there's talks that the Lions potentially draft Stafford's replacement with their first pick of the draft. So at the time of all these rumors, given last year's trade or this year's replacement, which seems more likely?
That he stays, you mean, or that he
so
draft a replacement?
Obviously last year we looked at it and we're like, you and I kind of both agreed last year on the show that, he's not getting traded at this time. I mean, maybe someone had some sort of intel on that, but it seemed unlikely, and obviously that was correct. But is it more unlikely that the Lions draft Stafford's replacement in the first round?
Yeah, I think it is because Stafford, they're not going to be trading him this year. In the scenario that Bob Quinn and Matt Patricia are in right now, where they need to win now, I will say that Tua, if the Lions were to stay at 3, Tua might be the best value just because he's a quarterback at pick 3 when you take, that positional value into account. But he's not going to provide anything this year. And, you might be able to make a trade down the line for either Stafford or potentially Tua if they were to take him. I just don't see how it makes sense for a team that's in win now mode to select a quarterback of the future. Maybe, you'd like to think that Bob Quinn wouldn't leverage, this is my quarterback, we have to draft this guy to try to get another year, get a little bit more flexibility, saying we have our quarterback, we need to stick this out for a few years. I don't think Martha Ford would accept that by allowing Bob Quinn just to take a quarterback to extend his time. But I just don't understand why Tua, or, Tua is just the obvious choice at pick 3. That there's even reports, the Lions have had digital meetings with Justin Herbert. But a quarterback, it's unlikely that they're going to find a quarterback that'd be an upgrade over Stafford. And given Stafford's cap hit, they can't trade him this year. But they need to win now. So why would you select a quarterback that's not going to help you win now?
Yeah, it seems like ever since a couple of years ago with the great Patrick Mahomes experiment, a lot of people just want to, even if they have a steady quarterback a la Alex Smith with the Kansas City Chiefs, who was pretty serviceable. You had Travis Kelce and Tyreek Hill have over 1,000 yards in a season together under Alex Smith, but they made possibly the best and least known draft gold mine with Patrick Mahomes. And it seems like a lot of people just want to do that again. And obviously there's not going to be, looking for Patrick Mahomes, there's not going to be one in every draft. But do you see someone maybe mid to late first round or even the second round who has that all-pro talent that people just really aren't talking about, that could, under the right system and in the right circumstance, be one of the best at his position in 2, 3, 4 years? Do you see someone who's just not really being talked about that much?
As from the quarterbacks, not really. I think there's so much, and you see it so often where these young quarterbacks come in and have a ton of success. And more often than not, you look at the team around them, and it's almost like the quarterback is the last piece of the puzzle. And even with Mahomes, Mahomes is a great quarterback, but he came into just a fantastic situation with the Chiefs. Even with Alex Smith, there's a quarterback. They still had won what is it, 11 or 12 games with Alex Smith the year before they had Mahomes. And then, it's just one of those deals where, like, you saw Derek Carr just a few years ago, who was in the MVP race, and everyone thought he was going to be the next great guy. And then his offensive line starts going downhill. He doesn't have a running game anymore. They lose Khalil Mack, and all of a sudden, he's just a guy that, maybe the Raiders even want to move on from. There's plenty of those guys every year. So there might be a younger quarterback who, in a few years has a really successful season, but I just don't know if there's any players in the second or third round that, I would say can carry teams like great quarterbacks do. But in the right situation, you never know. They can rack up a lot of wins with the team, but it might not necessarily be all because of the quarterback.
Yeah, so you just talked about the report that Mike Garafolo talked about with Justin Herbert in the interview that they had with him, the virtual interview. Is this just a smokescreen or a ruse that they're just talking to quarterbacks right now, trying to get that trade up? Is it likely that the Lions do try to do that trade back situation?
Yeah, I think that's the ideal situation and scenario for the Lions would to be trading back, because I think Jeff Okudah, outside of the quarterbacks, I think Okudah is the second best player in the draft behind, Chase Young. And you look at draft history, I think the cornerback position is becoming more valuable in the NFL, and especially in the Lions defense, where it's predicated on man coverage, and you have to be able to cover for a while, given that there's not going to be a ton of pass rush. I think Jeff Okudah is very valuable for the Lions defense, but you just go back and look at the history. There hasn't been, a cornerback selected in the top 3 in the last 20 years. But you look at picks 4, 5, and 6 in the last 20 years, and there's been 7 cornerbacks selected. So I think the Lions are just looking at value and trying to make sure that they can maximize their value if they were to select a corner. But the Lions, pretty much anytime they're picking in the top, the last couple years, they've interviewed the top quarterbacks. I don't think that's anything new. I think it's more due diligence than anything. And if maybe a player were to fall and they fell into the laps, they might consider it. But I wouldn't necessarily call it a smokescreen. I just think that's how they run their business. They're going to interview all the top candidates.
Yeah, so with that number 3 pick, kind of a 2-part question. Is the most likely scenario that they will trade it and trade back, try to maybe get an extra second or even a late first from someone trying to make a big jump? And then on top of that, who are the likely suitors, other teams that are probably going to look to be trading up with the Lions? Like I've heard the Dolphins thrown out a lot, but yeah, is it pretty much they're going to trade the pick, and then who are the teams that you think would be the most likely to trade with them?
So right now, like I said, I think the Lions highly covet Okudah, just because coming from that Patricia scheme, or that Patriots scheme, Patricia, you look at the Patriots, and they've always spent quite a big money and invested heavily at the cornerback position. And the Lions, even though they've missed on guys like Richard Sherman and like Malcolm Butler, they're usually pretty consistent that follow that Patriot lead of, going after some bigger name corners. And I think they need that corner playmaker. So Okudah is really important to them. So right now, 5 and 6, Miami, and then 6 at the Chargers, both need quarterbacks. And if they both like the same player, it would be perfect for the Lions, because it's going to create a bidding war. Now, if Miami likes Tua, or actually maybe Miami likes Herbert, there's been reports about that as well, and the Chargers like Tua, they're going to be really a need to trade. I don't know if teams that are so quarterback hungry are going to really risk anything. And I mentioned it earlier that, it's almost always, anytime a team wants a quarterback, they usually have to trade up to get them. So I think 5 and 6 right now are the most likely scenarios where the Lions could still get Okudah, and you have 2 teams that desperately need, a long-term solution and a younger quarterback, kind of a face of their franchise type of guy that you usually have to trade up to get.
Yeah, and so in a perfect world, Chase Young falls to the Lions at 3, and they take him. You posted a funny mock draft the other day with, we saw what the Lions did last year with their draft, where they picked a bunch of weirdos, and this year, they had like Golden at a wide receiver there, and then Keyshawn Vaughn at the very end, like just a bunch of randoms that we're not really looking at. But that's kind of how Bob Quinn's operated. If you look at his drafts, he's very unpredictable, in his style. Chase Young falling to them at 3, is that really that far out of reach though? I mean, if the Redskins copy what the Cardinals did last year, Rosen to Kyler Murray, or do they go Haskins to Tua or Herbert or something, and then obviously Burrow going to 1 to Cincinnati? Does that leaves Chase Young there on the board for him? Is that really that unlikely?
I wouldn't call it unlikely, but I don't think I'm not getting my hopes up, because I do think you look at the roster of the Redskins, and they've spent a lot of draft capital along the defensive line, and yet they still have pretty big holes. They traded away Quentin Dunbar, who was their cornerback, one of the better cornerbacks in the NFL, and kind of unheralded and underappreciated last year. And then Josh Norman, who he wasn't really doing much for him last year. He pretty much got benched. They cut him. So they do have a need at corner. And then also you look at their tackle position right now. Trent Williams is still demanding a trade, so they need a left tackle. So I could totally see where the Redskins might be willing to trade back and, either try to get Okudah or one of the top tackles in the draft class. And maybe they're not completely infatuated with Young, or they think they can get more value by adding more picks with the new head coach, Ron Rivera, coming in. So I don't think it's unlikely. I just, again, I'm not going to get my hopes up, because that would be the perfect situation for the Lions if the Redskins were to trade with a quarterback needy team and Chase Young, who is a generational talent. I think the only generational talent in this draft. I think that word sometimes gets thrown around there a little bit too loosely. But yeah, he's one of the top defensive end prospects at just a premium position that you've seen come out of the draft probably since Myles Garrett. So yeah, I'm hoping for the best there, that he'll fall, but I'm trying to keep it out of my mind so I'm not disappointed.
Yeah. Is it? And then if it's not, obviously Chase Young is perfect scenario, but it might be wishful thinking. I know as Lions fans, we all know about hope. So we got it in droves with it when it comes to this team. But if it's not Okudah, who, whether it's between 3 and 6, if Okudah's off the table or something, I don't know, something comes out. We've seen things come out before of just teams moving past that. We think they're going to pick a player, and then the day before we get a report that they're picking someone else. Is there anybody else on your radar, on the Lions' radar, in that their top pick who they could be looking at that isn't Okudah?
Yeah, so, I mean, Isaiah Simmons, I know he's a fan favorite of some, and he is just an athletic freak, and pretty much everything he did at the Combine. Yeah, you saw that on film. The guy is just such a unicorn. That's the only word I can really put on him, because there's not really any comparative player that is like him. And in the Lions defense, I don't think he's a good fit as a linebacker, as their inside linebacker at least, just because he doesn't have that physical style, and he's only 238 pounds, whereas the Lions typically want 250 pounders, and their linebackers don't need to have speed because they're just gap fillers and they're strong at the point of attack. And that's not really Simmons' game. But I think if the Lions would be willing to be a little bit more open-minded and play him in maybe a strong safety role and kind of like a nickel linebacker, just make sure he's always on the field, I think he could be a great fit. But I just don't think he's a natural linebacker in the Lions scheme. And my underrated, and I know you had mentioned it earlier that, I kind of put up that mock draft for the Lions that had a bunch of players that aren't frequently mocked or, aren't fan favorites. And I had Tristan Wirfs on there. Yeah. It wouldn't surprise me if the Lions took a tackle if Okudah wasn't there after a trade back, just because right now you have, Taylor Decker is in a contract year. I don't know if he's necessarily trying to come back or if the feeling's mutual, where they both the Lions and him are trying to get a deal done long term. But anytime you don't have a left tackle for the future, you kind of need one. And Tristan Wirfs is a guy who I think could be a left tackle, but not only that, this year with the huge hole at right guard, he could be the right guard. There's already, before the draft, people question his athleticism because he was such a mauler in the run game. And anytime someone's strong at run blocking, for whatever reason, they're always like, oh, he's just not a good athlete. But Wirfs is a great athlete, and he has the ability to be a guard and be a little bit more of a versatile chess piece along the line. I could I wouldn't rule out the Lions drafting just an offensive tackle or that kind of a guard that can move to tackle to fill a hole and a long-term need if they're unsure about Taylor Decker.
Yeah, I saw your last tweet. Kenny Wiggins is fine. Come on.
Oh,
that was a great signing.
Yeah, I know. You knew it was going to happen.
Yeah.
And you just hope, they rotated him in and out with Dahl and Glasgow last year, and he was, in my eyes, you could always tell when he was on the field because I feel like he was always allowing pressures or, wasn't helping out in the run game. I didn't understand that guard rotation, and he's a guy who, yes, he's a veteran, and he does provide a little bit of experience at the position, but I wouldn't want him as a starter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, if the Lions do not take a cornerback, obviously you said the most likely choice is probably Jeff Okudah. But if they don't take a cornerback with their first 3 picks, it already seems odd, but is it pretty clear then that Patricia and Quinn would believe that Amani Oruwariye is quality starter material? Or?
Yeah, and that's – if they didn't pick a cornerback in the first 3 rounds, yeah, they're definitely – or the first 3 picks, I think they definitely that's showing a lot of faith in Oruwariye. But what's also odd is that Oruwariye, even though he had some growing pains last year, when he did play, he was making plays too, picking off Aaron Rodgers, having a really nice undercut and picking off a pass against Haskins, against Washington. I thought Oruwariye showed a lot of promise, but he might not be completely ready yet. But if you look at like the strength of the draft, I think the cornerbacks outside of Jeff Okudah, there's a really strong second tier of cornerbacks the Lions could target in the second round. And if the Lions, if they did trade back and didn't get Okudah in the first round, there's quite a few like consolation prizes or guys that I would feel comfortable with in the second round that they could go after. So I don't know. The Lions, I feel like they have a lot of holes, but they don't have any glaring holes on their team. They have a lot of guys that could be penciled in as starters, but it doesn't necessarily that they mean they couldn't be upgraded. So that's going in the draft. A lot of times you do want to take the best player available, and the Lions could go to a lot of different ways, really.
Yeah, do you, with like maybe not their first pick, but whether they get another first rounder in the second, third round, this draft loaded on a lot of positions, but especially wide receiver. I have a lot of mock drafts I've seen, especially from the big names, have sometimes 4 or 5 going in the first round. Do you see the Lions using one of those, maybe if they trade back and get another first round, or using their early second on one of these wide receivers? I know they have Galladay and Jones, even though Jones is getting up there in age, not quite, but moving that way. Do you think they'll go with one of these? It seems like we have so many talented wide receivers in this draft. Do you see them picking one early on, or would they wait till the later rounds?
I could totally see that, because you think that in the first round, at the end of the first round, where the Lions are picking high in the second, there might be in all likelihood, there's going to be a pretty good receiver sitting there, and the Lions don't have any receiver under contract next season. Galladay, you hope that gets an extension, but it's unlikely that Marvin Jones resigns or Danny Amendola back. But in my mind, you look at guys like Justin Jefferson, who is a slot receiver who I think could help the Lions out quite a bit. Really good at contested catches, is a pretty solid athlete, decent size. I think he would fit well in this scheme, especially as a slot, to kind of be the heir to Danny Amendola, and maybe even, slowly out-snap Amendola as the season goes on. But Brandon Ayuk is another guy who, before the combine, was, kind of labeled as a first-round pick, and he seems to have slipped a little bit because he didn't have a great combine, but it comes out he had an injury, and, he had that procedure done to help that out. So maybe that, I believe it was a 4.5 flat 40 that he ran. It's not indicative of what his game speed was, so I really like Ayuk. Denzel Mims is another guy who kind of flew up the boards a little bit more after running a 4.38 and being a big 6'3" guy. Really great at contested catches. I think the Lions really like him kind of as an outside guy. But there's plenty of receivers I think the Lions could look at, and I think it would be even if the Lions were to trade back and get another either late first or early second round pick, I think that value at the receiver might be real nice, and the Lions are going to need one for not only immediately to kind of groom and to have that fourth receiver that can step up if need be, if any of the top 3 get hurt, but also long term.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and And drafting by positional need is always important, but sometimes, especially when you have multiple picks in a round, you kind of just want to pick the best overall talent, and a lot of that could be a wide receiver in that early second round.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I'm usually almost always best player available. I don't like reaching for needs just because that's where you get in trouble. You can usually fill needs either through trades or free agency. But the draft, you can't be passing up top talent, no matter really what position it is. And it's not like the Lions don't have a need at receiver. It's long term, I think it's a big need, but it's not so much as of an immediate need as maybe cornerback or right guard or, an edge player or defensive tackle. But you can still try to fill those players out and hope that a really good player falls to you in the later rounds. And if it doesn't happen, make a trade, mid-season or before the season starts to try to make it happen. But don't be passing on a great player just to fill a need.
Yeah, if you had to place a wager on it that Marvin Jones Jr. was gone before the trade deadline next season, would you do it?
Yeah, I probably would. I think if the Lions are playing well, though, and are still in playoff contention, I don't think they would. Maybe if they drafted a receiver, like a Denzel Mims or, another outside type of receiver that could make Marvin Jones maybe a little bit redundant. Yeah, they'd probably trade him. But anytime you have a player that's going into the last year of the contract, is still valuable in the eyes of the league, is a nice rental player for teams that are trying to make a push that have a dire need midseason and there's not many options to help. You always have to consider looking at trades or at least listening to offers when it comes to the guys in the last year of the contract that you don't know if they're going to be back next season.
Yeah, besides Jones, are there any other Lions names that you would put money on not being there come trade deadline time this season?
I don't think if the Lions were to somehow get a tackle, maybe Taylor Decker, if they feel like they're not going to be able to get a long-term deal done with him. But again, if they don't have, some sort of plan in place immediately as a blindside protector, you can't just really get rid of him mid-season. Jared Davis, with all the linebackers the Lions have on the roster right now, Jared Davis was drafted for Terrell Austin's scheme as a 4-3 middle linebacker. In Patricia's scheme, where they like their linebackers to be able to play on the edge and are usually taller than Davis and a little bit bigger. I know Davis has put on some weight to be a little bit more of a thumper, and he always kind of was a more physical player to begin with, but isn't necessarily great taking on blocks and just maintaining his gaps. He's a bit of a wild card at time. I know the Lions love his work ethic, but I just don't know if he's a natural fit for the defense like Patricia needs. And if there's any value out there for a team that's really looking for a linebacker, especially maybe like a weak side linebacker, that more of a run and chase type of linebacker, or one that in a scheme that's a little bit more free, where they're not always taking on blocks and the linebackers are set up to just get after the ball. I think Davis is a missile once he knows where the ball's at. It's just I think he's a guy that I think the Lions really like, but I could see them trading as well at the trade deadline.
What do you think are the three biggest positional needs for the Lions this year to address, and who is your favorite player in this draft also?
So my three biggest needs, I think right guard, although the positional value isn't great, I think that's the biggest hole in the roster, followed by either the jack linebacker, kind of the edge rusher, or the CB2. But I like Aruarie. I wouldn't be too upset if we had to go into the year as him as a potential starter. And the same thing at jack linebacker. You look at what the Patriots have done a lot the past few years is they have linebackers like Jamie Collins and Kyle Van Noy and Dante Hightower, guys that can play on the edge but also play off the ball. Whereas Devon Kennard last year for the Lions, it was kind of weird because Devon Kennard, when he played for the Giants, he played a lot of off-ball linebacker but also on the edge. And then once he came to Detroit, he was pretty much just strictly that edge player, that jack linebacker, where I could see the Lions using a lot more interchangeable linebackers on the edge this year if they don't necessarily draft a true pass rusher early. So I don't know. I think right guard is probably my first. edge just because the Lions need pass rushing help so bad. Maybe they could go defensive tackle route, pass rusher there, and then corner. And then my favorite player in the draft is probably definitely Chase Young or Okudah.
Yeah.
The guys, kind of an unspectacular answer, but those are my two top prospects.
Yeah. So besides a player that may be drafted this season, who do you on the Lions roster already? Who do you see as a breakout player? Someone maybe that we've seen the name a couple seasons, or they just picked up that's going to make a bigger than expected impact. Who do you see as like that guy?
So I think Duron Harmon, I really like that trade that the Lions did, not only because Harmon is like a true free safety and he has a ton of ball production. He makes plays in the fourth quarter that, the Patriots fans call him the closer just because of all of his interceptions he's had late. But he is a true deep safety where last year Tracy Walker is kind of a chess piece in the Lions defense where he moves around and covers. He plays all over the place, and they were using Will Harris as a deep free safety once they moved on from Quandre Diggs. And I don't think that's Will Harris's calling card at all. Back in college, I thought he was just a really athletic, more of like a slot corner in the box type of safety, just because you didn't see those natural instincts of him playing deep, and that's where the Lions played him predominantly. So I think that Duron Harmon trade not only gives the Lions a true free safety, but also will put Will Harris in the box a little bit more, and I think play to his strengths. So I'm really happy with where our safeties are at right now. And the Jaron Kearse signing, I think, is a very underrated signing as well.
Is the end of the Stafford era coming? I mean, do we have to start thinking about, finding his replacement? Maybe not this year or maybe next year. I mean, obviously the dead cap is more. It's more simple to part ways in the next couple of years than it would be obviously this year. But when do you see this happening, or is he a lifer Lion?
That's a tough one because as much as I don't think the Lions' woes the past decade have been Stafford's fault, I could see if a new regime and a new front office were to come in here and they were given the green light to rebuild, I could see them moving on from Stafford and trying to get, a bunch of picks for him and kind of rebuild the team the way they want it to be built. But, I'd like to think – I think Stafford has a ton of good years left. As 32 years old, that's kind of hitting the prime for a quarterback. You see all these, Drew Brees, Tom Brady's that keep playing and playing and playing. With Stafford's arm strength, I think he'll be able to stay in the league and only get smarter and learn the league better. It's not like from a physical standpoint, he's going to be falling off a cliff anytime soon. So I don't want to say that Stafford is on his way out, but you never know what a new regime is going to think of him and what their game plan is going to be for how to rebuild the roster.
Yeah, I have one last question for you. It's kind of the big one every team asks at the beginning of every season, and especially the Lions. I haven't heard in the past couple of seasons, maybe it's died down, of this could be our year, but even if we don't have that feeling this year, what are the realistic expectations that we should have for this season? Like, what are the things that won't be getting our hopes too high, but also won't be making us look at every cloud in the sky and yell at it?
So I think the realistic expectations, the expectation should be the Lions are in playoff contention, that are at least playing meaningful games at the end of December. As of right now, it's tough to say before the draft, what exactly their roster is going to look like. But at this point, I don't necessarily think that their roster has been upgraded since last year. The free agents they brought in have kind of just, replaced the free agents that they lost. But, the draft could change that quite a bit. But I think the biggest thing that will help the Lions this year is just if Matthew Stafford can stay healthy, I think he almost immediately makes them a 500 team. You saw him carrying the team last year. It's what he does. So as long as he's around, the Lions should be around a 500 team. If they actually hit on some draft picks and have immediate, like, big impact type of players, maybe even a Pro Bowl rookie or something like that, the Lions could be, around 10 wins, I would say.
All right.
Well, hey, Logan, man, I appreciate you coming on. Like last year and again this year, I'm going to try to aim to have you on for some post-draft analysis. It's going to be a little different this year, watching it all, virtual, but it's still just as fun as ever. I won't miss a beat, and I'm sure you won't either. So we'll make sure we follow up with you in May sometime.
Oh yeah, for sure. I know that this draft process has been a little bit different, and just going to be at home this year, not doing much of anything watching the draft, and same with all the teams. It's odd times, very unprecedented, but yeah, as far as the draft research goes, it hasn't changed much. So yeah, I'd love to be back on the show and kind of go over what the Lions did and give you my thoughts.
All right. Appreciate it, man. Take care.
Yep. Thanks for having me.